For a long time, the story we hear about Central American migration gets kind of, well, drastically simplified. But today we are going to dive right into this explainer and really unpack the complex historical sociology behind it all. We're going to explore the deeply intertwined legacy of U.S. foreign policy and massive demographic shifts, looking specifically at how late 20th century geopolitical intervention essentially came home to roost.
Here is our roadmap for today. 1. The roots of mass exodus. 2. U.S. intervention and instability. 3. Discriminatory asylum policies. 4. The sanctuary movement. And 5. An influential American bloc. Let's get right into it.
Okay, before we start looking at the macro-level data, we really need to ground ourselves in the actual devastating realities on the ground that forced this mass exodus in the first place. Listen to this quote from Guatemalan immigrant psychologist Mario Gonzalez. "So many were tortured to death that if the army took you into custody and you survived, those in your circle would suspect you as a traitor." I mean, wow. This exodus wasn't born from some sudden random desire for material wealth, right? It was born from vicious civil wars that literally forced people to flee for their lives.
Moving on to sections 1 and 2, Roots of Mass Exodus and U.S. Intervention.
So, to understand why people fled, we have to look back. For decades, reoccurring patterns of U.S. military and economic interventions directly fueled chaos in the region. In El Salvador, Washington backed General Hernandez Martinez during the 1932 slaughter of up to 30,000 Pipil Indians, a horrific event known as La Matanza. In Nicaragua, the U.S. supported the Somoza dictatorship for over 40 years. That is, until the 1979 Sandinista uprising prompted the Reagan administration to arm the infamous Contra Army to destabilize the new government. It was just a continuous cycle of intervention.
Now, underneath a lot of these interventions lay some very strict economic motives. Take Guatemala, for example. You had democratically elected President Jacobo Arbenz, and he attempted to distribute unused land to landless peasants. Sounds reasonable, right? Well, because this threatened the vast landholdings of the American-owned United Fruit Company, President Eisenhower actually authorized the CIA to organize an armed overthrow of Arbenz in 1954. This single, calculated action totally crushed Guatemala's brief experiment with democracy and sparked a bloody civil war that lasted for 40 years.
And the resulting civil wars yielded just an unimaginable level of devastation for such a small region of the world. The fatalities were absolutely catastrophic. We are talking about more than 250,000 people dying across Guatemala, El Salvador, and Nicaragua. And tragically, these victims perished mostly at the hands of their own militaries or right-wing death squads, which were often heavily armed with U.S. weapons and aid. This sheer carnage is what directly prompted the massive human flight northward to the Mexican border and eventually into the United States.
Which brings us to Section 3, Discriminatory Asylum Policies.
Prior to this point in time, U.S. law generally only granted refugee status to people escaping communist regimes. But the massive public outcry over the Central American exodus led Congress to enact the 1980 Refugee Act. By its very definition, this law declared anyone eligible for asylum who had a well-founded fear of persecution based on race, religion, nationality, or political opinion. And crucially, it expressly stated that it no longer mattered what kind of regime was in power in the refugees' homeland.
But, despite this totally clear legal framework, the reality on the ground was a completely dual and discriminatory policy based entirely on Cold War politics. Look at this disparity. It's actually wild. Between 1983 and 1990, the Immigration and Naturalization Service granted over 25% of asylum requests from Nicaraguans fleeing the leftist Sandinista government. Meanwhile, they routinely intercepted, denied, and interned Salvadorans and Guatemalans who were fleeing right-wing governments the U.S. actively supported. They granted them an abysmal 2.6% and 1.8% approval rate, respectively.
The data clearly shows us that Washington's absolute obsession with stopping communism blinded it to its own complicity in making these regional divisions worse. By portraying the conflict simply as this giant worldwide battle between democracy and communism, officials entirely ignored the long-festering deep divisions between the rich elite and the desperately poor indigenous populations in these countries. And the result? Hundreds of thousands of fleeing Salvadorans and Guatemalans were forced to sneak across the border into a really precarious illegal existence in the U.S.
Now for Section 4, the sanctuary movement. So concluding that the federal government was actively violating its own 1980 Refugee Act by jailing and deporting these people, religious leaders and civil rights activists stepped up and built what was essentially a modern underground railroad. They called it the sanctuary movement. Starting in places like the Southside Presbyterian Church in Tucson, Arizona, the idea spread like wildfire across the country.
Hundreds of churches openly defy the government to provide safe haven, legal assistance, and food pantries to Central American refugees.
Now, to understand how these communities integrated, we really have to look at who these refugees actually were. The movement had to adapt to highly diverse demographics. For instance, Salvadorans were largely urban mestizos, often with prior trade union experience, so they naturally gravitated toward major cities like Los Angeles and Washington, D.C. Guatemalans, on the flip side, were largely indigenous highland Maya, fleeing literal scorched earth policies. They relied heavily on tight kinship networks to settle in agricultural areas like the Florida Everglades or working-class neighborhoods in Houston. And here is something absolutely crucial to note. Though the movement was led publicly by American clergy, objectively speaking, the true inspiration and structural direction actually came from the politically active refugees themselves. A lot of them had been student leaders or activists back home. For example, Guatemalan refugees in Chicago formed a sub-network they christened La Red Atanasio Tzul, named after an early 19th century Maya independence leader. They were the ones secretly organizing, speaking at universities, and educating North Americans about what U.S. policies were really doing in their homelands.
Finally, Section 5, an influential American bloc.
To truly wrap your head around this demographic shift, just consider the sheer scale of the migration. The U.S. Census counted only 94,000 Salvadoran-born inhabitants in the entire country back in 1980. Less than 4 decades later, by 2017, the Salvadoran population alone had exploded to more than 2.3 million people. That is a staggering jump. And similar jumps occurred for Guatemalans and Nicaraguans, forever altering the ethnic panorama of major U.S. cities and rural farm belts alike.
With the threat of immediate deportation eventually lifted by hard-fought legal victories, like the pivotal ABC decision that struck down the INS's discriminatory policies and actually overturned 100,000 denied asylum requests, these communities rapidly put down roots. They organized. They made their presence felt. In 1990, Ana Sol Gutierrez became the first Salvadoran-born elected official in U.S. history. In the labor sector, Salvadoran and Guatemalan janitors became the absolute driving force behind Los Angeles' massive Justice for Janitors campaign. And over in North Carolina, Guatemalan poultry workers at Case Farms orchestrated a militant campaign for union recognition that really caught the attention of national labor leaders.
Employers initially recruited undocumented Central Americans assuming they'd be this docile, easily exploited workforce who wouldn't dare complain. But their incredible resilience, which was literally forged in the fires of civil war, proved exactly the opposite. Whether in major cities or small towns across the American heartland, they showed a remarkable ability to organize for better conditions, eventually boasting some of the highest labor force participation rates of any ethnic group in the country. Ultimately, the historical record caught up with policy. In 1999, an International Truth Commission reviewed declassified government records and formally accused the Guatemalan military of acts of genocide. But crucially, it formally and objectively acknowledged that American intervention via the CIA directly supported these illegal state operations. This devastating, formal finding finally recognized the complicity that jump-started this entire cycle of displacement.
So what should you take away from all of this? Well, this history challenges us to view demographic shifts not as random, isolated events, but as the deeply intertwined legacy of our own foreign policy. Central American refugees didn't just arrive here. They survived, they organized, and they forced the amalgamation of various historic immigrant groups into a broader, much more complex Latino mosaic. I'll leave you with this question to ponder. How does knowing the true roots of this mass exodus change the way you look at the communities around us today? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and as always, keep learning.